you for coming today and joining us for our author talk, sponsored by the Rutgers Summer Session New Brunswick and the Rutgers University Libraries. My name is Melissa Just, and I'm the Associate University Librarian for Research and Instructional Services here in the Rutgers Libraries, and I am pleased to introduce today's speaker. Joanna Kempner was recently promoted to Associate Professor of Sociology in the School of Arts and Sciences. She is a member of the Institute for Healthcare Policy and Aging Research, recipient of the Rutgers Board of Trustees Research Fellowship for Scholarly Excellence, and a blogger for migraine.com. Joanna writes and researches about medicine, science, politics, gender, and the body. She also studies forbidden knowledge, how scientists come to understand which science is too controversial, sensitive, or too taboo. Dr. Kempner received her PhD from the University of Pennsylvania's Department of Sociology and worked as a research associate at the Center for Health and Wellbeing at Princeton University. She was also a postdoctoral fellow in the Robert Wood Johnson Scholars in Health Policy Research Program at the University of Michigan from 2004 to 2006. Please help me welcome Joanna Kempner as she talks about her book, Not Tonight, Migraine and the Politics and Gender and Health.
Hi everyone, thank you for coming. Do I need this, or can I talk really loud? Can I talk really, I can sometimes talk really loud. Okay. Thanks for the introduction. It's really an honor for me to be here. I'm so pleased, I'm really pleased that this book is out. For some of you, you know this, but for others of you, I like to say this book was a very personal project for me. I was inspired to write this book back when I was getting my PhD. I was taking a medical sociology class when I was a graduate student. And we were reading a lot of disease-specific studies, studies about epilepsy, studies about cancer, studies about all kinds of diseases. And I come from a family where everybody gets migraines, and I get migraines. And I was like, there's nothing here really about pain, and there's certainly nothing here about migraine. And that struck me as kind of odd, because from what I knew, migraine was a really debilitating, really stigmatized disorder. And it just sort of stuck with me. I saw this real gap in what we knew in the social sciences. And I really knew firsthand the stigma, the disbelief, and the lack of understanding that people with migraine experienced. I was really also inspired, this was back about 12 years ago, I was inspired by this new research that had come out showing that migraine was actually a brain disease, right? That it was actually a neurobiological disorder. And about 12 to 15 years ago, that was a really radical idea. And when I had first heard that, I can't tell you what a wave of relief I felt. The first time I heard a doctor tell me I had a brain disease, I was thrilled. And it took me a few minutes before I was like, wait a minute, that's kind of strange. Why would a brain disease make me so happy? And that also interested me as a sociologist as well. But any case, I thought it would be really interesting to figure out what kind of revolution, certainly a revolution would come about for migraine now that we knew it was a brain disease. But as I did my research, I realized that revolution never came. And that's what my book came to be about. It came to be about why all of this new brain research that showed that migraine was real, that it was a biological disease, hasn't really legitimated migraine, why people with migraine are still being ignored, dismissed, delegitimated, and they still feel like others think they're imagining their pain. The other reason why I'm so pleased this book came out is because while I was writing this book, writing a book takes a long time, in my case, a really long time. And during the process of writing this book, life happened. I moved to several institutions. I moved, I think, 5 different apartments. I had 2 babies. And during that time, my migraines went from episodic, so maybe I was having 8 or 9 migraines a month, which is actually a lot, to having migraines more days than I didn't have migraines. I developed chronic migraine. And At first, I managed the migraines as I had always done before. I took my drugs and I just pretended they didn't happen. But eventually I started to grow really desperate. I tried everything, medical and alternative. I took acupuncture, I took herbs, I went to massage, physical therapy, chiropractic. I actually saw a woman who called herself a witch, and she said she could see inside your body with her hands. She said I had a very blue aura, and she prescribed me a week of enemas. I didn't actually go through with it. But I nearly did. If she wasn't so expensive, I might have done it. My doctor, who's a very, very good headache specialist, put me on a drug called Topamax. Now, Topamax has a really famous side effect of causing cognitive deficits. It's so famous, in fact, that Topamax is nicknamed Dopamax. And I had some trouble thinking when I was on Dopamax. And perhaps that's why, for at least a few months, I had accidentally doubled my dose, during which time I spent several months wrapped up like a burrito on my sofa, practically in tears, before I realized what was happening. So writing this book presented a lot of challenges. And when I started this book, I hadn't realized that that was going to happen to me. I thought my migraines were annoying, but I didn't know that I was going to end up on my sofa wrapped up like a burrito. I had a migraine when I interviewed at Rutgers. I had to leave one of my interviews with one of my now colleagues so I could throw up. And when I got here, that Dopamax was causing so many problems. I was really having trouble with my lectures. I was having trouble recalling words. So there were times when I thought that this book wouldn't happen. And so as I investigated migraine and as I was reading the words and interviewing people with migraine, I really related to what they were having. So this is a book, in the book I say, this is a book where I consider my body a field note. This is a book where I'm really trying to give voice to people who are in pain, where one of the things that I wanted to do when I wrote this book is I wanted to make it accessible. I wanted to make it a book, not that didn't just speak to academic audiences, but I wanted to make this a book that allowed people who had migraine to be able to read it and to feel a kind of radical acceptance, that I understood what they were going through. And I really wanted this book to be a kind of what we in sociology called a public sociology project. I wanted to resonate with a number of different audiences in medicine and with people who are sick. So I'm very, very grateful that it's out here, and I really thank you for coming. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about migraine. I'm doing something a little different with this talk. It's going to be all pictures. So we'll see how it goes. It's going to be pictures, and then the things that I'll occasionally read some quotes from the book. This is, and a lot of it uses what's called migraine art. There's a whole genre of art inspired by migraine. This is a picture of migraine drawn by somebody with migraine, and I think you can see here that migraine causes a lot of anguish, right? It looks pretty painful. But I think it's also should be said that the migraine experience is really variable. It's a spectrum disorder. Some people have migraine only every once in a while, and they don't really think it's a big deal. Some people have migraine every day. Some people have migraine all the time. They never get a break from their migraine. But even one migraine can be pretty severe. So I'm going to read you a quote from Joan Didion. Joan Didion is one of the most famous migraine sufferers, and I think she describes migraine pretty well here. Migraine gives some people mild hallucinations, temporarily blinds others, shows up not only as a headache, but as a gastrointestinal disturbance, a painful sensitivity to all sensory stimuli, an abrupt overpowering fatigue, a stroke-like aphasia, and a crippling inability to make even the most routine connections. When I'm in a migraine aura, for some people the aura lasts 15 minutes and for others several hours, I will drive through red lights, lose the house keys, spill whatever I'm holding, lose the ability to focus my eyes or frame coherent sentences, and generally give the appearance of being on drugs or drunk. The actual headache, when it comes, brings with it chills, sweating, nausea, a debility that seems to stretch the very limits of endurance. That no one dies of migraine seems, to someone deep into an attack, an ambiguous blessing. So in other words, a migraine attack can be completely disabling, and the World Health Organization categorizes it as disabling as paraplegia, which is to say that when you have a migraine, that day that you have a migraine, from the World Health Organization's perspective, is considered as you can't do anything. You're in bed, you're done for the day. Nothing much can get done. Are you enjoying all of these painful pictures? So migraine is characterized, a headache is just one of its symptoms. The headache can last, and you don't need to have a headache to have a migraine. You can have a migraine without the headache. But the headache lasts, is about moderate to severe pain. It can last 4 to 72 hours. It usually comes with nausea or vomiting, photosensitivity, sometimes other autonomic symptoms like very high sensitivity to smell. It's usually inherited, not always though. It's considered neurological. It's extremely common. 12% of the adult population has migraine. It's anywhere between 1 to 4% of the adult population, in addition, has chronic migraine. So they're getting migraine on more than 15 days of the month. And it is more common in women. So 75% of the people who have migraine are women. That means a lot of the people who have migraine are men. It's so common that 6% of the US men in the adult population have migraine. So that's a lot of men. Now, I've been showing you all these crazy pictures, right? But that's not how we normally see migraine. We normally see migraine represented like this, right? Or maybe like this. We see a woman, she's generally white, she looks pretty well off. She often has children in her care. And the pain, she always has her hand up to her head, and it's not really clear whether or not she's in pain or if she just can't remember where she put her keys. She usually can't take care of her kids. Here you have, this is an ad running now. This is an ad for Botox. The woman's laying in a rather decadent red sofa, and everybody else is going about her day. And I think what we see, and one of the things I argue in my book, is that migraine in everyday, particularly in everyday advertisements for pharmaceutical drugs, is represented as a lifestyle condition. It's usually a condition of privilege. The women, it's almost always women. They're well-off women. They're women who are able to ignore their duties, whatever they are. And it's also usually represented as a symptom of femininity, the kind where women just can't take it anymore, right? She's just like, I'm just gonna lay down in the middle of the subway station. I just can't take it. And migraine's often treated as such. Its dismissal of symptoms is so prevalent that I started to think of the delegitimation of migraine as a symptom of migraine. And Joan Didion, this is back in the 70s, talks about this. Here's another quote from Joan Didion. All of us who have migraines suffer not only from the attacks themselves, but from this common conviction that we are perversely refusing to cure ourselves by taking a couple of aspirin, that we are making ourselves sick, that we bring it on ourselves. So Joan Didion gets this back in the 70s, and I think that's still true today. It's back to my migraine art. Now, as a patient, I really felt this acutely. I felt this gap between my own migraine experience and the level of severity that it was sort of the seriousness with which it was taken by doctors, by employers, by the general public. And when I did research, I was really struck by how prevalent this feeling was. Everywhere I looked, people with migraine, even the people who treated migraine, they were deeply affected by this gap. This gap between the extraordinary disability of migraine and the way it's trivialized in broader culture. So in the book, I end up calling this the legitimacy deficit. And nowhere in this legitimacy deficit more apparent than in patient narratives. So one of the things I do in the book is I talk to patients and I read a lot of patient accounts of their migraines. So I want to tell you just a little bit about Heather. Heather is one of the headache advocates who I spoke with a lot. Heather is a woman who had headaches her whole life. And by the time I met her, she had daily migraines. She had numbness and tingling in her extremities. She was in constant pain. She was hardly working. She was just barely holding down a job. And she was really frustrated because the advice she kept getting from family and friends was that she should just stop stressing out. So one of the things she says is, and this is a quote, It is extremely frustrating and terribly heartbreaking to know that while I'm stuck in home, suffering, that people are thinking I am nuts, stressed out, drug-addled, and unreliable as a friend or person in general. It's difficult to know that at any one time, when I mumble about having a migraine, that someone is thinking, just shut up and get over it already. I can't even say, I have a migraine to anyone without thinking I come across as fake and or whiny. I don't even want to say it to anyone because it happens too much. I cannot wave a magic wand and make myself suddenly feel up to doing what needs to be done. And that was a sentiment that I saw absolutely everywhere. Now, this legitimacy deficit has really tangible repercussions. It's a kind of stigma that gets institutionalized, particularly within funding. Now, this is a chart. I don't know if you can see it very clearly, but this is a chart that was just published in JAMA in January. And what it does is it charts NIH funding. This is in millions of dollars here on the y-axis. And in the x-axis, you have a measure called DALYs, Disability Adjusted Life Years. It's a measure that basically standardizes how much disability a particular disease has on the population. And here's the regression line. And you can see most diseases fall in that regression line. And the idea is the NIH should be taking these DALYs into account in their funding line. Some diseases are doing really well. Right up there at the top, you see HIV/AIDS and cancer. They are getting funded above the amount of disability that they cause. But some diseases are doing really poorly. Peptic ulcer, earaches, ear infections, and migraine. Migraine's basically off the charts. Migraine is terribly, terribly underfunded by the NIH. It's getting between $10 to $12 million typically from the NIH. It's really a very, very small drop of money. And other headache disorders are basically getting no funding at all. Now, headache specialists, who are mostly neurologists, and headache advocates, they understand that this is happening, and they're really trying to change how the public understands migraine. And the way they've been doing this is by trying to repackage migraine as a neurobiological disease. They're really pushing it. And it was one of the first things that surprised me about my research back when I started it. I went to a professional headache conference. It was a huge conference up in New York. And this was in 2001. And given my experience with migraine, I thought I would go to this conference and there would be headache doctors kind of laughing at their patients and talking about what a pain we all were. But instead what I found were brains everywhere, these big posters of brains, and everybody was talking about brains. And they were talking about migraine seriously, and they were excited. They were like, everybody was saying, people are gonna take migraine seriously. And their idea was that maybe if migraine is understood to be a migraine disorder, we can overcome this way people think about migraine, this sort of psychosomatic past that, migraine was thought of as a hysterical, woman. But as I did my research, I realized this hasn't worked out as planned. So one thing that I think really drives this point home, as part of their PR plan to sell this idea that migraine's a neurobiological disease, the American Headache Society was able to recruit Cindy McCain to their cause. Cindy McCain became a spokesperson. Cindy McCain has migraines. And she began talking to journalists about her migraines and the new science behind migraines. And I just want to show you how she was covered in the press. So here she is in the New Yorker. The segment is called Not Tonight Department. And they listed migraine as one of many ailments that McCain had already complained about, including a sprained wrist obtained, quote, when a supporter of her husband's presidential campaign very vigorously pumped her right hand. They noted that, quote, everything about her seemed lemony, and they described McCain's commentary as astringent. She came off as an overprivileged socialite whining about insignificant discomforts. So in other words, even as they spoke about the neurobiology of migraine, they also made migraine seem like a condition that affected a certain kind of woman, right? That kind of privileged white woman who can afford to take time off of work and just lay in bed like this. So I wanted to figure out how to make sense of this. Why is the science not able to trump culture in this sense? And so in my book, I pay particular attention to culture because I think that culture ultimately shapes how knowledge is produced. And that's partly why I call the book Not Tonight, right? Because I really want to draw attention to these ideas that we have about disease and how these ideas we have about disease shape even the very science that we produce about disease. So for example, one of the things I point out in the book is that if you look up headache in the thesaurus, it lists spouse and wife as synonyms. That's really interesting to me, right? Headache can also be a synonym for stress. These are kind of cultural metaphors that headache stands for, and these cultural metaphors are really powerful. They can sometimes be so powerful that they kind of overrun this science. They're jokes, but they're deeply entrenched in our collective consciousness. So I wanted to take a look at these jokes and these cultural ideas, and I wanted to look at them over time, and then I wanted to see how they infiltrated the science, what we know about migraine. So I'm going to just take you through a quick romp through history to see how these ideas developed. Now, so where does this idea that migraine affects a kind of hyper-feminine, sort of hysterical woman who can't handle stress, where does it come from? Well, this is an image from Alexander Pope's Rape of the Lock, 18th century, famous 18th century poem. And I think one of the things that I think really is remarkable about migraine is that as far back as you look, migraine is represented as something that affects a particular kind of person. So here, Pope portrays Belinda. Belinda's the protagonist in this particular poem. Portrays her as pensive in bed. I don't know if you can see her. And what she's doing is she's mourning the loss of her favorite curl of hair. What is she doing? How is she mourning that loss? She's having a migraine. For her. So, and I think that's so emblematic of how we think about migraine. It's just the thing you need to lay in bed. Belinda, devastated as she was by her hair, had what was in the 18th century called the nervous temperament. This is an image from Sense and Sensibility, and some of you may be familiar with Jane Austen's Marianne Dashwood there. Marianne Dashwood didn't have migraines, but she did definitely have the nervous temperament. And here, she's heartbroken. She walks through a rainstorm and she nearly dies, right? The nervous temperament is real medical theory in the 18th century, happens to people who have good breeding, so they're upper class, and they have high sensibility, which means that they're artistic, they're intellectual, they're creative, they're witty, but they're also sickly, and they come down with nervous disorders like hysteria, hypochondria, the vapors, and migraine. The problem was with their nervous system. The upper class breeding, that good breeding, gave them nice, thin, elastic nerves, and that meant that they could transmit thoughts really quickly, and that's what made them so witty and fun and smart, but it also meant that they would get sick a lot. So high sensibility was physiological, but it also lent itself to these kinds of disorders of personhood. It's also gendered feminine, but it was something in the 18th century that was highly sought after by men, right? Gentlemen, for example. So it's neurologically based also, but it's also socially located, particular kind of person, the Marianne Dashwoods of the world. In the 19th century, the nervous temperament turns into the hysteric. Women start to come down with nervous headache or clavis hystericus. It's still physiologically based. I think it's really important to keep that in mind. We're not talking about made-up mental disorders, but they are headaches that affect, again, the upper class, schoolboys that use their minds too much, and hysterical women. So here's a description in the late 19th century of hysterical headache. This is by James Ross, a neurologist. Hysterical headache is met with in females and is generally accompanied by other symptoms of hysteria. This form of headache is on one hand closely allied to trigeminal neuralgia and on the other to true migraine. The pain is sometimes diffused and deep-seated, but it is more frequently limited to one spot and feels as if a nail were being driven through the skull, hence it is called clavis. Hysterical headache is increased in severity during the menstrual period and by mental worry, whilst it is removed by amusement and anything which engages the attention. So what you have here is essentially a migraine, but it's a migraine that you can be distracted from by just being entertained. And that's the kind of idea of essentially a woman who, it happens to women who think too hard, essentially. You don't want to think too much. Now, the late 19th century becomes a really interesting time for headache medicine because in 1899 you see the release of aspirin. Aspirin is a very, very important development for the pharmaceutical industry, right? Because they finally develop a drug that works. It's a very important development for headache medicine because aspirin is good for headaches. You have Bayer. It revolutionizes medicine and gives doctors something to give their patients, revolutionizes the pharmaceutical industry, revolutionizes headache care. But does it change how the headache patient is seen? I love this advertisement. This is actually a little later in the 20th century, but here's a Bayer advertisement about a Bayer break. When you're feeling hot heat beat, time to take a Bayer break. So even like this medicine that makes people feel better is represented as something, for a particular kind of woman to take a nice break. So anyway, moving on to the mid-20th century. The mid-20th century is really famous for the development of psychosomatic medicine, and the mid-20th century is really where we start to develop this idea of the type A personality and people who are neurotic and developing pain disorders because of stress, because they're neurotic. But one of the things we often forget about the mid-20th century is it's also a time when scientific medicine really flourishes. The father of modern headache medicine was an innovator both in psychosomatic medicine and also in scientific medicine. His name is Harold G. Wolff, and this is a really famous photograph of one of his experiments he ran on headache patients. What he's doing here is he's measuring changes in the vascular system of this man while he has a migraine. So what he would do is he would give his patients something that would trigger a migraine, and then he put them in this contraption, and he could measure changes in the vascular system. And what he was able to do then was show that there was real physiological changes during migraine. And that showed that migraine was real. But Harold Wolff also really believed that the true origin of migraine pain was in the psyche. He was a believer in what was called the headache personality. And so he thought if you had a headache personality, which was very much like a type A personality, that would trigger this physiological response in the form of migraine. He described the migraine personality as ambitious, successful, perfectionist, and efficient. So in other words, somebody who was a person of good moral character. And this is a article that popularized this idea of the migraine personality. And you can see here, the migraine personality is very much a kind of masculine ideal. But still, migraines are a luxury to have, right? It's still a condition of privilege. And here in his words are how he describes the migraine personality. The individual with migraine aims to gain approval by doing more than and better than his fellows through application and hard work, and to gain security by holding to a stable environment and a given system of excellent performance, even at a high cost of energy. He developed this profile mostly by talking to his own patients and also by looking at himself. He had migraines. So there was a real selection problem in his study. He was at Cornell Medical School. He worked on the Upper East Side. He had very rich clients. So he was basically looking at businessmen. And so his migraine personality is the migraine personality of businessmen. So without a doubt, he had his own obsessive and perfectionist tendencies in mind. He also thought the migraine personality was very, very, he didn't think it was an imaginary thing. He didn't think psychosomatic medicine was in any way kind of real or made up or imaginary. He thought it was a very kind of real, tangible thing, which I think is important. But what about women with migraine? Here's an ad from a headache journal, the Professional Medical Journal on Headache from the 1960s. And you can see the woman represented with migraine in this ad looks like a woman from the Victorian era. Wolf didn't have a lot to say about women with migraine, but when he did talk about them, he talked about them as sexually frustrated and frustrating. And this is a quote from Wolf. He said that women were, quote, unwilling to accept the female role, particularly in sexual relations. He described 80% of his female sample as sexually dissatisfied. Quote, orgasm was seldom attained, and the sex act was accepted as, at best, a reasonable marital duty. In several instances, it was deemed frankly unpleasant and was resented. Furthermore, the migrainous woman was sometimes reluctant to accept the consequences of maternity. In contrast, his male patients, he said, were sexually well-adjusted, unless, of course, they had the misfortune of being married to one of these frigid women. That sometimes happened. Now, here's another ad from the mid-20th century. His colleagues were not so kind to women with migraine. They paid a lot more attention to women with migraine. Walter Alvarez, who was one of the founders of the what was then called the American Association for the Study of Headache, wrote a lot about women with migraine in the mid-20th century. And what he wrote was that he worried that so many migrainous women would seek diagnostic tests and spend so much money on doctors. He thought it was a waste of time. And this is what he said you should do with your migraine, your female migraine patients. He said, first of all, the more appropriate role for the physician would be to spend time with the patient in talking over her life problems and in showing her how to live more calmly and happily than in making useless examinations. He added, it's an axiom with me that whenever a woman is having 3 attacks of migraine a week, it means she is either psychopathic or else she is overworking or worrying or fretting or otherwise using her brain wrongly. And he gives an example. If, for example, the exciting cause of the attacks is marital infelicity and much thinking about divorce, he said he could almost cure the disease by getting the woman to see clearly that she isn't tough enough or heartless or unkind enough to go ahead and get the divorce she craves. Then when she stops thinking about it, she stops having headaches and gets as well as she can be. Of their husbands, he would tell them, you had to have an angel to put up with all your illnesses, and you got him. So that was women migraineurs in the mid-20th century. Just for fun, here's another mid-20th century ad for women for nervous headaches. So the emphasis in the mid-20th century was really on nervousness, on anxiety, on calming women's nerves, and so forth. Now, given this backdrop, you can really see why headache specialists that I saw in, the new millennium were so excited about the brain. The brain seems so revolutionary against this backdrop of talking about psychopathic women who are frigid. The brain seems like a clean slate, a way to get away from the sexist history. And now you can see why I was so excited to have a brain disease. Having a brain disease seems so much better than being talked about the way these other doctors were talking about women with migraine. And I think that one of the things that really surprised me, and it took me a while to kind of figure this out, was that even when doctors talked about brains, when they talked about women with migraine, they sometimes understood and talked about the brain through some of these cultural stereotypes. So the brain ended up not being such a blank slate. And I'm just going to read just a little bit of the book about this. So what happened was the neurobiological paradigm starts to be talked about as the migraine brain. And in this kind of popular discourse about the migraine brain, it starts to take on a lot of the kind of gendered stereotypes that I saw that I think the doctors were trying to get away from. Okay. So a close examination of medical talk about migraine reveals that the neurobiological turn in migraine has not erased the idea that migraine affects a particular kind of person. To the contrary, a specific kind of moral character remains embedded in the new neurobiological explanations of migraine, this time in the form of what is sometimes called the migraine brain. The migraine brain refers to the highly sensitive, overreactive neurological system of the person with migraine. And here's a quote from a book called The Migraine Brain. The average person's brain doesn't react too dramatically to minor irritations or interference. That's generally not true for people prone to migraine. The migraine brain is as high maintenance as they come. Like a thoroughbred racehorse or diva, it's hypersensitive, demanding, and overly excitable. It usually insists that everything in its environment remains stable and even-keeled. It can respond angrily to anything it isn't accustomed to or doesn't like. A migraine brain is always on alert, ready to overact to any stimulus it finds displeasing. So when I read that quote about the migraine brain and how it's kind of neurotic, this is what I see. The migraine brain becomes a neurotic organ, prone to throwing temper tantrums at even the smallest environmental changes. Although migraine differs from most psychological disorders in that it is not a disorder that alters the personality, people with migraine do often act in ways that others may deem antisocial. It is typical and recommended, for example, that people with migraine avoid anything that might trigger an attack, whether that trigger might be red wine, lack of sleep, fluorescent lighting, or wafts of perfume. As a result, a person with migraine might abstain from alcohol, leave parties early, or insist that friends forego perfumed lotions. In 2010, a Detroit woman successfully sued her employer for failing to keep coworkers from wearing scented products that had been triggering her migraines. Bernstein and McArdle, who wrote The Migraine Brain, argue that such people are not themselves high maintenance, even if they may seem that way. Instead, it is better to think of them as being in possession of high maintenance brains. The migraine brain thus serves as a neurobiological explanation for many of the same personality quirks that have always been ascribed to those with migraine. A tendency to demand that environments change to their desires rather than a stoic ability to adapt to the changing world. So what I think is the migraine brain just becomes the migraine personality, right? I'm not the one who can't stand these lights or who can't drink. Just my brain can't handle it. And I'm not convinced that displacing those personality quirks onto the brain does much for stigma. It might reduce personal responsibility because I can't help what my brain does. But if I'm not my brain, I'm not sure who I am. And the way that the brain gets talked about as a kind of diva, as a kind of high maintenance organ, has a kind of gendered resonance. It doesn't quite get us away from these stereotypes in the past. Now, that might seem a little bit picky, but when we look at like the pharmaceutical advertisements, this one from the right is a contemporary advertisement, and we look at them next to these ads that look so horrifying, they don't look that much different. Here we have this woman who is in pain and she can't take care of her kid, and the headline is escape, right? She's escaping from the sort of dreariness of her work. And here are these other women, basically, they're like, oh, take me away. I'm not sure how much those representations have changed over the years. And I find that really striking because over the last 200 years, the status of women has changed. Medicine has changed. All of these things have changed, but the representation of migraine hasn't changed. Here's another ad. Somebody just tweeted this to me yesterday, and I thought it was amazing. This is a really contemporary ad, and here is a hero doctor, a white knight, saving a woman with meds. Right? So we still have these highly gendered representations of what migraine is. Now, one of the problems I see is that migraine advocates who are so desperate for legitimacy, right, so desperate for people to take them seriously, are really embracing the migraine brain, and I completely see why, because remember, I also embraced the migraine brain, right? Like I also was so thrilled to have a brain disease. And so they talk about themselves as having a migraine brain. One migraine advocate suggested everybody wear, a heart-shaped brain necklace so that we could all see that they have sensitive brain. This is about zombie, I can't even read that. It's about zombies eating brains. Not even a zombie would want my migraine brain. It's kind of a funny t-shirt. But it's all, migraine advocates embrace this language. And it's not that I think the neurobiology is wrong, I'm just not sure it's the right framework for lowering stigma. But then again, I'm not really sure what the right framework is, and that's the kind of big mystery at the end of my book. So I'm going to end this talk by just sort of saying, like, well, what is the right image? This image was just taken of, this is David Dodick, one of the top headache doctors in the country, giving this man who has migraines from a concussion some Botox shots. And it just won a photography contest. And I thought that was a kind of interesting image. It's an image we don't see very often. But you know, how do we alter images? How do we alter? What's the right frame for talking about headache disorders? I'm really not sure. And I think that's probably the next step that needs to be done. I've been very good at critiquing representations. I haven't been so good at framing new representations.